Okay, I think everyone hears me now, and I will introduce our next faculty lecturing, and that's done by Dr. Grant White, our senior lecturer in liturgical studies. It's interesting to see that in the website of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, the first sentence which is given is, Grant White is an Orthodox layperson. And that's a statement that I think is quite interesting. A lay person, that's a word that actually comes from Greek. Lay, liturgia, means the people's service, simply. And this is what he's an expert in. He's an expert on the people's service, meaning the liturgy. And from that perspective, it's a perspective that is born with the Grant Dr. White, which means that not just the actual spiritual services, but also the contribution by the church as people. His interest is not just liturgy, but everything that concerns the people of a church. And he has specialized both on art and spirituality in the modern world, the theological approach of pastoral responses to suffering, for example, and also how communication functions in the church in through the dialogue with evangelicals and Orthodox. So he's an expert on lay theology. But I don't mean lay theology as, an amateur theology, but the people of God, the theology for the people of God. And as such, he has focused very much through the years on understanding that voice of the people of God. He has been doing a lot of research on that perspective from various cultural perspectives, both Byzantine and Oriental perspectives, Syriac or Ethiopian perspectives. And in that capacity, he was recruited way back when I was young, and Dr. White also was young, as a principal of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge in England. And then took a leave of duty, so to say, and spent an amount of hours taking care of family, taking care of Finland, and taking care of society around him. And then he ended up in our theological school. And in that capacity, I welcome you, Dr. White, as an expert on lay theology. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for that humbling introduction, a very kind introduction. All I can say is it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here today, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today about liturgy and liturgical theology. That title I gave you for the lecture, I must apologize for. It has the sound of a Douglas Adams novel. It's a bit too pretentious, shall we say, for the real aims of what my lecture are today. And so I'm not going to try to answer every question, obviously, but to rather focus on a more limited set of issues and questions. So what I'm going to do now is turn to the PowerPoint that I have for today. I've got to share my screen first, of course, and that's something I always still forget to do. There we go. There. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just move this over and start the slide show presentation of this. Let's try that again. There we go. All right, so as I say, the study of liturgy, history, theology, and the church for meaning in the 21st century. That's a big title for, as I say, a much more limited and I hope modest set of goals. So in today's lecture, what I hope to do is to give you an introduction to some of the central ideas in liturgical theology today, to introduce you to some sources and to point you to others. And most of all, my hope is to stimulate your own reflections and questions around the doing of liturgical theology today. I hope that this can be the beginning of a conversation about liturgical theology, not the end. And in that vein, all I can say is that if you've got comments or questions, please do write me. And I have there my email address at Sancti Ignatius, and please do write. I do respond. Sometimes right now in starting this new position, it takes me a little bit of time to respond, more than is often the case, but I promise I will respond, and I welcome your responses. So the content of this lecture actually is composed of two different things. First is some material I gave in a slightly different format at the International Society of Orthodox Church Musicians this past summer. And second, some material from a draft of the introductory chapter of a book I'm working on now, tentatively titled Living Tradition, Orthodox Liturgical Theology for the 21st Century Church. And so my hope is to give you a introduction to liturgical theology as a way of thinking about liturgy and the world, about liturgical experience and life in the world, about liturgical theology as a way of seeing the world, and then to raise some possible questions and issues that I see might be important for liturgical theology today. And last but not least, I've got some bibliography as well. So first of all, just basically, what is liturgy? And as Michael has said, the first definition, of course, is the work of the people. And that's a definition of liturgy that took hold during the liturgical movement of the 20th century in particular. It's rooted, as was noted, in Greek words for the people and for work. There's another definition as well that some liturgical scholars have begun to use in the early 21st century. It actually goes back, the idea itself was noted already earlier in the 20th century, the idea that liturgy is work for the common good. And last but not least, a definition from Father Alexander Schmemann in his essays Liturgy and Theology and Worship in a Secular Age. So first of all, liturgy is the work of the people, from the Greek words laos and ergon, people and work. This emerges as a definition of liturgy at the time when participation was the central issue of church's efforts at liturgical renewal. We can see the rise of the use of this definition of liturgy in the context of the liturgical movement, particularly among Catholics and Protestants in the 20th century. A movement which, among other things, sought to move the church away from a clericalism that had come to predominate in the churches in the Catholic and Orthodox, Catholic and Protestant traditions, to a theology of church not as heavily clericalized as that had developed in earlier times. And I must say, it's the most commonly encountered definition of liturgy one finds still today. However, other liturgical theologians, such as the Anglican Ruth Myers, and she relies on actually earlier Catholic liturgical theologians as well, notes that liturgy is derived from the Greek word liturgia, and many contemporary books and articles explain its meaning as the work of the people. But liturgia is not formed directly, she argues, from laos, but from litos, which means concerning the people or national community, that is, the public or the body politic. In the ancient world, she notes, it was a technical political term used for services rendered for the body politic. One might build a road or an aqueduct or supply equipment for the armed forces, required by law to perform these liturgies. Some citizens did so grudgingly, while others offered their services freely and willingly. Gradually, the term came to be used more generally for an act done in the service of another, not necessarily for the body politic, the litos. It also began to be used to speak of service to the gods, that is, worship. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, liturgia, as well as the cognate verb liturgin, was used almost exclusively for the worship of God performed by the priests and Levites in the tabernacle or the temple. It was never used for service to another person. And so while the older political use disappeared entirely, it likely underlies the decision of the translators of the Septuagint to use liturgia. The service rendered by the priests and Levites was offered to God for the common good. And so, as Myers goes on, the phrase the work of the people emphasizes the people who gather, those who proclaim and respond to the word and offer intercession, the assembly that celebrates a holy meal, by not also turning our attention beyond ourselves to the need of the world for God's reconciling love, continuing, she argues, to think of liturgy as the work of the people impoverishes our celebrations. And so in the book she has written, Missional Worship, Worshipful Mission, when I use, she says, the term liturgy, I have in mind both the structured ritual activity that involves texts and actions, using symbols, speech, song, and silence, and the assembly's work for the common good, its public service as a gathered community and as the people of God in the world. Liturgy as work for the common good is thus a form of participation in the mission of God. And that's a really important point in terms of linking liturgy and mission. And last but not least, a definition from Father Alexander Schmemann. And I would characterize Schmemann's definition as a prophetic word, as is so much of his writing. What is more serious, he says, however, is the fact that the liturgy, central as it may be within the activities of the church, has ceased to be connected with virtually all other aspects of the church's life, to inform, shape, and guide the ecclesiastical consciousness as well as the worldview of the Christian community. One may be deeply attached to the ancient and colorful rites of Byzantium or Russia, see in them precious relics of a cherished past, be a liturgical, quote-unquote, conservative, and at the same time completely fail to see in them, in the totality of the church's liturgia, an all-embracing vision of life. This is key for him, if you recall from reading his writings. An all-embracing vision of life, a power meant to judge, inform, and transform the whole of existence, a philosophy of life, shaping and challenging all our ideas, attitudes, and actions. Schmemann goes on, as in the case of theology, one can speak of an alienation of liturgy from life, be it the life of the church or the life of a Christian individual. Schmemann speaks this, of course, in the broader context of his critique of the church's life in a secular world, in the age of secularity, which we can talk about more later. Liturgy is confined to the temple, but beyond its sacred enclave, it has no impact, no power. All other ecclesiastical activities in a parish, a diocese, a local church, are based more and more on purely secular presuppositions and logics, as are also the various quote-unquote philosophies of life adopted by professed Christians. Liturgy is neither explained nor understood as having anything to do with life, as above all, an icon of that new life, which is to challenge and renew the old life in us and around us. A liturgical pietism fed by sentimental and pseudo-symbolical explanations of liturgical rites results. And of course, this reflects Schmemann's long-held views about the tradition of mystagogical interpretation of the Byzantine liturgy that had developed from the late 4th century onwards. And in fact, a growing and all-pervading secularism. Having become in the mind of the faithful something sacred per se, liturgy makes even more profane the real life which begins beyond the sacred doors of the temple. This double crisis of theology and liturgy, and note that word, crisis, is, I submit, the real source of the general crisis which faces our church today, and which must shape our agenda if theology is to be for us more than a quiet academic activity, if we understand it as our specific charism, right, our gift, and ministry within the body of Christ. And that's from his 1972 essay, Liturgy and Theology. Elsewhere, Schmemann talks about the very functions of worship itself. Now, anyone who is acquainted with the content and text of the great prayer of blessing of water at baptism and epiphany knows without any doubt that the term of reference is not the dichotomy of the sacred and the profane, as if we have one small sacred precinct we go to every week and then re-enter a profane world, but the sacramental potentiality of creation in its totality. And I think this is one of the most radical things that Schmemann says, as well as in each of its elements. Yet, anyone who is acquainted with our liturgical piety, in this case, the comprehension by the immense majority of the faithful of the meaning of holy water, knows equally well that it is the first meaning, that is, making something profane sacred, which triumphs here to the virtual exclusion of the second one, that is, the epiphany and the fulfillment of water's sacramentality. What is disturbing here is that such liturgical piety, such understanding and experience of worship, not only is in no way a challenge to secularism, but in fact is one of its sources, for it leaves the world profane, that is precisely secular in the deepest sense of the term, as totally incapable of any real communication with the divine, of any real transformation and transfiguration. Having nothing to reveal about world and matter, about time and nature, this idea and this experience of worship disturb nothing, question nothing, challenge nothing, are indeed applicable to nothing. They can therefore peacefully coexist with any secular ideology, any form of secularism. And there is virtually no difference here between liturgical rigorists, that is, those who stress long services, compliance with rubrics and the typicon, and liturgical liberals, always ready and anxious to shorten, adapt, and adjust. For in both cases, what is denied is simply the continuity between religion and life, the very function of worship as power of transformation, judgment, and change. I'll say that again. The very function of worship as power of transformation, judgment, and change. Now, Schmemann's own thought in the years since his repose has been critiqued by many, and rightly so. And in courses I've offered at St. Vladimir's in the past, I've always begun with an overview of the reception of Schmemann's theology in the 35, 37 odd years since his repose. And Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant authors have all offered various correctives and critiques to Schmemann's thought. I want to focus on one in particular, that by the American Jesuit Bruce Morrill in his book Anamnesis as Dangerous Memory. This is where Morrill brings the theology of Schmemann into conversation with the political theology of Johann Baptist Metz in an attempt to correct what he sees as Schmemann's underemphasis upon concern for the marginalized, the poor, and the suffering in society. So what Schmemann teaches, says Morrill, through his theology of time, is that there must be a definite break from whatever people's patterns of action and interaction are. That is to not say that there is no continuity between liturgical symbols and gestures and the rest of our experience of the world. Neither Christian cosmology nor eschatology will allow that. The point, rather, is that Christians must break off their regular patterns of societal and personal interaction, their ways of using words, bodily gestures, food, and drink as subjects in society and the wider world, and instead consciously and actively enter into a different, ritualized and symbol-laden pattern. So Morrill takes up Schmemann's point and modifies it about the continuity between liturgy and life. Christians need to know a way of living in relation to God, humanity, and all creation that can transform what they, due to arrogance, selfishness, indifference, resignation, or despair, already know and take for granted about the way the world is. The experience of the fulfillment of time in the Eucharist bears witness to time's finitude and limitedness, which constitutes the sanctification of time. And that's in Schmemann's Introduction to Liturgical Theology. Says Morrill, in other words, giving oneself over to the radical otherness, the transcendent, messianic, and eschatological content of the liturgy changes the way one perceives and prioritizes all aspects of life, interpersonal, economic, familial, political. I think that's a central point about that he draws out and expands upon regarding Schmemann's own approach to liturgy, even as he stresses the need for seeing the otherness of what we do in liturgy as well. What does this mean ultimately? Well, in our various definitions that we've looked at in this part of the lecture, what I'm trying to get at basically is that with liturgical theology, what we have is an account of the church's liturgy as a way of seeing the world. That is, liturgy is not simply ritual action, but entering into the church's liturgical life is a formative experience which transforms the very way we approach the world when we leave our liturgical assemblies. Morel notes that according to Schmemann, Christians must enter into the entire mystery of Christ, his incarnation, his redemptive mission and glorious ascension, and thereby receive the theoria, the knowledge and communion with God, which transforms their experience of the world. And this is from Schmemann's essay on symbols and symbolism in the Byzantine liturgy. This is only possible through a proper engagement with the liturgy, an adequate grasp of its eschatologically symbolic nature. Yes, I will talk a little bit later, however, about what happens if one overemphasizes a realized eschatology, as Schmemann, I think, does, and the dangers of that approach as well. So in any case, an experience given in Christ, energized by the Holy Spirit, of the world as epiphany, this is what a liturgical experience is, I'm arguing. An experience of the world as... Oh, I'm sorry. Am I speaking? Okay, shall I continue? Okay, an experience of Christ, in other words. A way of seeing the world that we are formed into in the context of our worship of God, energized by the Holy Spirit, an experience of the world as epiphany, of the world as sacrament, of seeing Christ in the world. All of this implies an understanding of the symbols of God in Scripture, nature, and liturgy. And here I'd refer you to Sebastian Brock's seminal book, The Luminous Eye, on the spiritual worldview of St. Ephrem the Syrian. I'd argue that we learn to see those scriptures of God through our encounter with God in our worship, in the church's liturgy. However, unlike Schmemann, I'd argue, such a way of seeing also includes seeing Christ in those who are suffering, marginalized, hungry, and poor. And this isn't simply Morel's point, of course, but it's a tradition that goes all the way back to the scriptures themselves, to the words of our Lord, to the tradition of our Lord's command to the church in Matthew 25, for example, his entire ministry of healing and teaching, exemplified, for example, by the approach of a St. John Chrysostom to the relationships between liturgy and how the church lives its life in the world, particularly with regard to how the church, that is, church members, treat those around them who are suffering, hungry, and poor. Now, after having looked very, very quickly, and I apologize for the speed with which I'm going through this, I want to try to make sure I get in as much as I can before my time here is up, and I'm just looking to see what we've got. Okay, great. So, given those definitions of liturgy, I want to ask the next question: where is liturgical theology today? And this is a portion of the material from the introductory chapter to my book in progress. Where is liturgical theology today? We stand as heirs of the rich body of reflection on liturgical theology written over the past 60 years by Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant theologians. And yet, an Orthodox liturgical theologian might be forgiven for asking, how has this body of work had an impact on the life of parishes and other Christian communities? Yes, we can point to the revival of frequency of receiving communion in some jurisdictions, such as the Orthodox Church in America, although not limited to that, of course. We can also point to a renewal of interest in liturgical art, architecture, and music, and in the ways in which these forms of art find expression today. There has even been the rare example of liturgical reform, based on the work of scientific investigation into the history of Eastern Christian liturgical texts and practices, such as the notorious to some, although not to me, work of the New Skeet communities in Cambridge, New York. Maybe you all are familiar with the New Skeet community's work. If not, we can talk about it a little bit later if you like. And yet, with no intent to minimize these good things, an Orthodox Christian, whether in the world of theological education or not, could be forgiven, I think, for asking, is this it? After nearly 60 years, is this all we have to show for it? It seems that as with the ecumenical movement in the field of liturgical theology, Orthodox Christians have planted the seeds, but then have left the harvest to others. We have increased the frequency of receiving communion, but the number of Orthodox Christians, in North America at least, continues to drop. We have liturgical services enacted with greater attention than ever to their musical, rubrical, artistic, and architectural dimensions. But our beautiful, well-enacted liturgical life bears, with notable rare exceptions, little, if any, conscious, deliberate relation to the homeless, hungry, marginalized people whom we pass on the way to church. We can talk with greater awareness than ever about the complex development of our liturgical services, their long trajectories of development, including the echoes of earlier practices our current services retain. But for many, our services themselves have become mysterious set pieces, intended for the generation of feelings of awe, otherness, mystery, rather than the occasion for the offering of the logiki latria, the offering of our very selves in union with Christ's own liturgy, offered on behalf of the cosmos. We speak of the beauty of the microcosm of our liturgical spaces, but we are at a loss to see any relationship between that beauty and the splendor of the cosmos created and redeemed by Christ. What we do in our liturgical services is divorced from the world, and not infrequently borders on a sign of being a kind of tribalism or sectarianism, a reinforcement of our self-understanding as Orthodox Christians, a people ranged against the other. We are, in other words, I think, in danger of losing our Catholicity. And that's this book, which I'm in the middle of writing, written out of a desire to see the Church live out to the fullest possible extent the mystery the Church celebrates in its liturgical life. In the context of liturgical theology, this living out of the mystery celebrated in worship means that when we ponder the Church's liturgical life today, we must ponder not only texts, music, gestures, architecture, art. Rather, we must first be attentive to other realities than the narrowly liturgiological: mission, loving service, ethics, the broad historical, philosophical, social, and economic reality of late modernity in which the Church lives, and the needs of people who live in this age. I fear that if we are not attentive to these things first, that the Church will ultimately reduce itself to a club, to a mystery cult, like the ones the ancient Church fought against and ultimately replaced. And so, in my book, I'm raising 12 questions, 12 issues, if you will, that I hope will begin to get at the question of Orthodox liturgical theology in the Church, for the Church in the 21st century. I don't have answers to these, mind you. I'm just raising the questions. I mean, in a sense, that's the easy part. But I think we need at least to raise the questions. And these are the ones I see. There are doubtless more, and I'd welcome your feedback on them. So, however, for any Orthodox liturgical theology, I think, to succeed, it must confront issues that earlier Orthodox liturgical theologies have avoided, questions around which the Church has tiptoed for the past 50 years. And these are: one, the issue of what it means to worship God in late modernity, and all that that location implies religiously, spiritually, philosophically, economically, socially. The question of which philosophical tools are most useful for the Church's reflection on liturgical theology. 2, the issue of Orthodox self-definition in late modernity. Are we simply the Church of the Fathers, and all that that self-understanding implies for how we see the world and ourselves? Is there more to Orthodox Christianity than that? If so, what? And what might that more have to do with how we approach our worship of God? What role does Eucharistic ecclesiology play in Orthodox self-definition? And might an ecclesiology based on baptism provide a necessary corrective to a nearly exclusive reliance on Eucharistic ecclesiology in how we define ourselves? Third, the issue of liturgical reform. This is the proverbial, I don't know what term you grew up with. I grew up with the term the 2-ton elephant in the room. Everyone recognizes, but nobody talks about. The necessity, desirability, mechanics of liturgical reform and renewal, its relation to the larger issue of authority and its exercise in the Church today, and its relation to the vexing question of tradition, its process and its content, and clearing away the tangle of prejudice against liturgical reform in other Christian traditions, especially the Catholic. It is fine to critique other traditions' liturgical reforms, to be sure, and I think that's a legitimate thing to do. But I would wish that as Orthodox liturgical theologians, we could do so beginning from a point of seeking to understand why reform took place in the first place in those churches before coming to our own judgments about them. And of course, much of this debate is rooted in Schmemann's own approach to the first wave of liturgical experimentation after the Second Vatican Council. This is a larger issue, of course, and again, we can talk about that more later if you want. Fourth, the place of liturgiology in the formation of liturgical theology. How much historical study is enough for us to be able to articulate an Orthodox liturgical theology? How much is too little? What is the relationship, if any, between historical critical study and liturgical reform and renewal? If there is a relationship, what is it? If there isn't, why do it? Apart from pure interest at the level of scientific historical research, which I'm not knocking, mind you. I deeply respect historical critical research. And I do think it does have a place, because we often can't know the deep roots of our traditions unless we do that research. So I think that's important, absolutely important. And I respect the research. But might we view the fruits of historical critical research into Orthodox liturgical traditions in terms of a kind of ressourcement, in which we come to a greater understanding of the riches of our traditions for the Church today? Fifth, the place of converts to Orthodox Christianity. And this may not be as large an issue in Sweden as it is in the United States, but I'll mention it anyway. The possible ways, and I'm not totally comfortable with the term converts, by the way, but that's a separate issue. And the possible ways in which the religious experience and theological perspectives of such people have influenced how Orthodox worship is enacted and thought about today. That is, people come to the Church. If they come from someplace else, they bring with them their own experience, their own understandings, their own practices, which inevitably, even if not consciously, affect how they approach what the Church does. And I think that's a factor in seeking meaning in what we do in church today that we need to take account of. 6, liturgy, art, and aesthetics. What is the particular aesthetic significance of Orthodox worship, if any? If there is, what is it, and what does it have to say about the kinds of liturgical theology we articulate? Does the experience of Orthodox worship foster a kind of aestheticism, divorced from ethics and the community of the Church? How has such an aesthetic approach to Orthodox worship been shaped by the philosophical movements of the past 200 years, especially Romanticism and its roots in Western esotericism? 7, liturgy and mission. Is there a relationship between liturgy and mission? If so, what is it? How does an Orthodox approach to liturgy and mission differ from Protestant and Catholic approaches? Might Orthodox theologians learn something from how other Christian traditions approach the relationship between liturgy and mission? Can the experience of worshiping God according to the Byzantine or other Orthodox Christian rites be related in a positive way to the broader search for spiritual meaning in which many late modern people are engaged? 8, liturgy and the life of the parish. How does our liturgical practice both strengthen and weaken the life of parishes in its many dimensions? Are the current forms of our rites or the ways in which we enact our rites today, even if a word is not changed, suited to the pastoral needs of parishes in the 21st century? If not, what needs to be done and on what basis? 9, liturgy and formation. We make significant claims about the power and significance of our liturgical life. How then does our worship of God form people into faithful disciples of God in Christ? Or do we run the risk of instrumentalizing our liturgical life if we ask such questions, making liturgy into a tool to serve some other end? I don't want that for sure. 10, liturgy and church. Schmemann and other liturgical theologians of the past hint at the idea that the image of the church at worship has more than functional significance, that liturgy actually has something to say, not only about how the church is, but how it ought to be. If this claim is true, does our liturgical life serve a critical function in the church's life and point the church towards changes in its life such worship requires, including in its understanding of ministry and ministries? Do we need to revisit the issue of the strongly realized eschatology present throughout Schmemann's account of liturgical theology? To put it another way, is there a place for suffering and pain in Orthodox liturgical theology as much as there is for eschatological joy? 11, we're almost done, folks. Liturgy, church, and world. Alexander Schmemann, the founder of the field of Orthodox liturgical theology, argues that liturgical theology really is about a sacramental understanding of the world, as we saw earlier. Do we really believe that today? Do we really believe that today? And I say that not as a critique of how people approach this issue, but rather in terms of the larger question of how worshipers today negotiate the having to live between two different worlds, or within two different worlds. One, the symbolic universe, if you will, that's set forth by our church's liturgies, and then the world in which we live most of our lives, one that's not governed by that understanding of the cosmos, one in which we take for granted very different assumptions about the world and how the world works. How do we bridge that gap? How do we make sense of that difference? How do we live in both in a way that is fruitful and life-giving and faithful? Where are the boundaries, if any, between the worshiping church and the world? And then last but not least, Orthodox liturgical theology and the Catholicity of Orthodox Christianity. Much, but not all, of the Orthodox liturgical theology written in the second half of the 20th century has been written from the perspective of the Byzantine tradition. How might Orthodox liturgical theology better reflect the breadth of Orthodox liturgical traditions? Byzantine, Oriental, Coptic, Syriac, Tewahedo, Church of the East. This is a pressing issue for me, and one that's especially near and dear to my heart, and another reason why I'm so delighted to be able to be here at Sancta Ignatius, because I think we really have an opportunity here, uniquely, I think, to develop such theologies. I won't say a theology, but theologies based on that greater embrace of Orthodox Catholicity. Now, after having said all this, you may think that I simply assume that as the expert, right? And thank you for that kind epithet, Michael. I'm humbled by your applying it to me. But I have to wonder at the same time, we still have to ask the question, whose experience do we take into account when doing liturgical theology? Is it primarily of the liturgical theologians, or does the experience of everyday worshipers, if I can put it that way, need to be taken into account as well. In the Liturgics and Liturgical Theology course, for example, we're reading through Nicholas Denisenko's book on how liturgical theology might incorporate and listen to, take into account the voices of and experiences of regular worshipers. And you can call them in terms of Aidan Kavanaugh's famous Mrs. Murphy, or who have you. But the point is, whose experience do we take into account, and how do we take it into account? I think this is a fundamental point that, and an issue that Denisenko raises that we ought to look at as well. From my own perspective, liturgical theology is an action of the entire church, not only of a certain group of people. I know that's a broad claim, and we can talk about that later if you like. And then before we get to bibliography, if you'll allow me to dream for a moment as a way of concluding this very rapid sketch. It seems to me that one of the things that we need to be doing today is to research how Orthodox liturgical traditions are actually enacted in the diaspora. And I'm not happy with the term diaspora, but we'll let it be. The point is, how do Orthodox communities enact, celebrate, perform their liturgical traditions today in new cultural settings, for example? Whether it be Coptic, Syriac, Tewahedo, Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox, Church of the East communities living in largely secular societies or secularizing. What are the forces that come to bear from life in those societies, the pastoral issues that arise that have an effect on how Orthodox communities actually live out their liturgical traditions? What are the ways in which traditions are enacted in new cultural contexts today? And here I know there are issues of preservation, continuity, identity, change, and development involved. I think there are also larger questions here around change in Orthodox liturgical traditions in light of Orthodox polemic, in many places at least, about the changelessness of Orthodox liturgy. Have you ever heard that? We Orthodox have the only unchanging liturgy from the time of the apostles. We know historically that's not the case. And I think as a polemical talking point, it may have outlived its usefulness. Change happens. And it happens in the context of Orthodox communities seeking faithfully to live out the traditions of their liturgical lives. And how those efforts bear fruit then in new situations, new places, I think is very important to look at. Because what this really means is we're looking at the process of tradition itself. Tradition as process as much as content. And I'd just like to say, I think that if I had to say, if I could dream, I would love to see Sankt Ignatius become a place where such things could be studied, where we could learn more about how Orthodox Christian communities in the diaspora, in new cultural situations, live their liturgical lives, especially in relation to the challenges that life in late modernity raises. I think this place would be an ideal location for such research involving musicology, liturgiology, ritual studies, social studies, among others. And we've got here experts in the languages and literatures of the spectrum of Orthodox Christian communities. So if I could just humbly suggest it, this is an amazing place with tremendous potential to be of service in such research to the churches today, if that's what we want to do. I just lift up in this context the research of two scholars that I think is important in light of this particular question. The first is Tala Jarjour of King's College London. Her book, Sense and Sadness, Syriac Chant in Aleppo, and then numerous articles of hers. For example, Chant is the Articulation of Christian Aramean Spirithood in Oxford Handbooks Online from 2015. Her essay, Safeguarding Tradition and the Authority of Representation, which addresses the question of the preservation of Syriac Christian musical traditions and the kinds of choices that are made when preservation attempts are made. Not to mention the action of preservation in the context of the continuing life of the communities within which such music is used and in which it has developed. I simply use the Syriac traditions as one example, but I don't mean to limit myself to that, of course. And then the work of Sarah Bakker, I think it's Bakker, she's Dutch, I think, isn't she? Kellogg at San Francisco State University, Ritual Sounds, Political Echoes, Vocal Agency, and the Sensory Cultures of Secularism in the Dutch Syriac Diaspora. And I mention this simply because it's another approach to the question of the continuing life and thriving of ancient Christian traditions in secularizing contexts, and how we understand the dynamics of that life and the survival and development of such traditions. I think these are absolutely critical to be studied today. Okay, folks, now, last but not least, I've got some bibliography for you. I suppose I can find a way to, actually, just checking the time, find a way to get this bibliography to you if you're interested. It basically is the bibliography that's behind what I've been saying today. And the last thing I'd want to say, and this is perhaps you may find it an odd way to conclude, but when I think about the task of a worshiper living in the modern world today, an Orthodox worshiper, living out of the rich symbolic universe, and of course, by symbol I mean far more than mere symbol, but rather symbol in terms of participation in the realities to which they point. When I think about that life, oddly enough, I sometimes find myself thinking about Andy Warhol. That may sound like an odd choice. Perhaps you know this, maybe you don't, but after he died, it was revealed that he had been a faithful Ruthenian Catholic worshiper throughout his life, attending the Divine Liturgy at, St. Vincent Ferrer Parish in Manhattan for years. Silently, he apparently took great pains to hide that fact. And only recently, there have been studies of the relationship between Warhol and religion, but more recently have the relationships between Warhol's later work in particular and Byzantine iconography started to emerge. But my point here is that in thinking about a person who lives with regular experience of that symbolic universe, participates in it, and then seeks to make meaning, I would say, although I can't read his mind, but who finds expression of that participation in a very different way in his life. And I'm thinking, of course, of his art. I wonder if there might be fruit for, or material for reflection upon how we today, all of us who participate in the church's worship, are called to live out our participation in the worship of God in our own creative ways in the world today. All right. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your patience with these. And I guess we can turn to questions now, if there are any.
So, thank you so much, Dr. White. I will invite everyone to place questions. And you place questions by using the chat function, which you found down if you're using Zoom, which you are doing. And I will pick up the questions, not one by one, but I will try to pick up various questions that are similar and address them to Dr. White. And hopefully we'll see the interesting discussion that will take place here now for half an hour approximately. So the first question I would like to address to you, Dr. White, is how do we move away from structures of high clericalism in the liturgy?
Fantastic question. I think that the issue of clericalism doesn't necessarily involve the question of change of ministerial roles in liturgical celebrations, but it has more to do with how we interpret ministries in the church themselves. And I wonder if it's possible to think about the expressions of power and hierarchy that do exist in our liturgical celebrations, and the ways in which clergy are themselves symbols of authority in a different way. That is, to interpret those in terms of our Lord's own call to his disciples to exercise a different kind of authority, namely an authority based on service. I think our clergy today obviously do this already. I mean, who, if I can put it very bluntly, to become a member of the clergy today involves a great sacrifice. It's in the world we live in. And so recognizing that, how might we understand our liturgical actions as a whole, in which all the people of God participate in ways that challenge traditional ideas about authority, power, and hierarchy? Yes, we use images of power, we use gestures and symbols and hierarchies that, if interpreted how people outside the church understand hierarchy and power, that's all that's there. But could we look at those in a different way and instead look at them as a radical critique of how, broadly speaking, the world sees power? And so the bishop who is vested for a hierarchical divine liturgy, for example, becomes not the symbol of hierarchy and power and authority, but rather of kenotic service in love. I don't know. I think we have to talk about developing a way of thinking about our rituals as critiques of how other symbol systems in the world see power and authority. And I think here, just to throw out an idea, that Bachtin's use of the carnivalesque here might provide one interesting avenue for at least conversation. Not saying we should adopt Bachtin and the carnivalesque in its entirety, but I think there might be something to look at there. But this is a larger issue having to do with ministries in the church in general that goes beyond liturgy, of course. We should continue the conversation.
Yeah. The next question is about languages. As we all know, many of our Orthodox churches use ancient languages, which are reproduced from centuries ago, and sometimes not even possible for young people to understand. So the question is, do we actually need these languages today, or should we just switch to the language of the country we exist in?
Another fantastic question that is enormously, enormously difficult to give a simple answer to. Because, of course, as we all know, language is never simply a means of communication, but it's also a means of transmission of cultures and of meanings from the communities that produce the text themselves. And that translation itself always involves a compromise. It always involves a decision about what a particular word is going to mean in a particular context. A decision which often then, for those who don't know those languages, means that they will miss out on what are often the nuances behind the use of a particular word or a phrase. To be honest with you, I'm of very two different minds about these things. Of two very different minds. I mean, the first is born out of a deep respect for all of the linguistic and cultural traditions represented in Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches, and an awareness of the necessity to preserve and understand and use those languages. On the other hand, I also see the crying need for people to be able to understand what they're praying. And I don't have any good answers about how one works that out. I wonder if, in terms of individual parishes, for example, again, this is what I always say in all of my classes, what does your bishop have to say about this issue and the pastoral responses that parishes make to this issue? So it's a question of participation, I'd say of mission as well, and maybe even simply retaining people. If you don't understand what's going on, then does participation become a marker of identity for sure, but one in which one is not able to participate further in what the liturgy offers, what God offers in our liturgical life. It's such a complex issue, but I think it's one that we ought to look at in a concerted way. Just for beginners, a symposium or a class dedicated to this issue, bringing together people from the church, from the academy, to talk about these issues. I know that's been done before, but might it be worthwhile doing again?
The next question is about suffering. And the question is, if you take, for example, liberation theology, Emilio Torres and others, would that count as a kind of liturgical perspective? If you use your way of rephrasing the understanding of liturgy or liturgical?
I suppose so. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned liberation theology here, because well, I'll return to that point in a minute. Sure, you can see it that way. You can see liberation theology as a liturgical theology in the sense that the liturgy after the liturgy, articulated by Anastasios of Tirana, and then taken up further by Yombria, is also a liturgical theology. It's a living out of who one encounters in the church's worship, with particular emphasis upon the attention to those who are poor and marginalized. And I know here we're talking about what in the Roman Catholic Church is the famous preferential option for the poor. As far as I know, that's never been articulated by any Orthodox council. I'm not criticizing it, but simply saying we don't have that to work with in our Orthodox communities. However, we do have plenty of ways in which we can directly see our own ministry, our response to people who are suffering and marginalized out of our liturgical experience. I'm convinced of that, but it takes, again, a new way of talking about meaning. and talking about what we're doing when we worship God and what it has to do with any of the rest of our lives. So we make a deliberate, conscious connection, like St. John Chrysostom does, for example, among others. Does one have to use a liberation theological approach? I don't think so. Morel tries to do that to some extent in his book in using Johann Baptist Metz. As you know, perhaps Schmemann was highly critical of liberation theology. To be honest with you, I don't know the extent to which, to what he was reacting to specifically. But there are many kinds of liberation theology, of course. And so it's difficult to generalize about that.
The next question is about Romanticism. And you mentioned in the lecture how Romanticism has shaped the aesthetic perspective or aesthetic understanding of liturgy. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that perspective?
Sure. I was thinking about Romanticism and approaches to liturgy and aesthetics primarily in terms of Romanticism as a reaction to a response to the Enlightenment, and particularly to the rise of the broad scientific narrative and the world that it had begun to create. The difficulty with using appealing to Romanticism as an influence here, of course, is that one, as you know, one of the chief emphases in the Romantic movement was the role of the individual and the individual's feeling and the individual's perception of nature. And I'm not sure how fully that corresponds to what Schmemann's doing. However, I do think that a turn toward beauty and sensation and feeling in response to secularity is a move that one can attribute to the influence of Romanticism. You know, whether one means specifically specific Romantic poets or whether one means more broadly an aesthetic response or reaction to modernity.
Next question is about what is required for celebrating liturgy together? What kind of faith consensus is required in order to participate together? Could liturgy be a way towards unity, or is it the expression of unity?
Classic question, huh? That's a fundamental debate and a source of contention, isn't it, in the ecumenical movement, in bilateral and multilateral dialogues. That precise issue, and it came to a head, did it not, in the events that led to the creation of the Special Commission for Orthodox Participation in the World Council of Churches. At least that's how I interpret one of the factors there. You know, the question of how Orthodox participations in WCC events had come to be disturbed, to say the least, by the liturgical celebrations that those events had. Not only their inclusion of elements that were not Christian, but also, if I understand correctly, the whole issue of whether liturgical participation is to be a means or an end for the unity of the church. And as you know, many Protestant theologians would argue that liturgy can be a means toward unity, particularly celebrating the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy. This was an issue that came to the fore in debates in the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius in England in the 1930s. The question was raised. Well, since we all in the fellowship, Anglicans and Orthodox, are able to say that we share the same faith, might we be able to share the Eucharist together in this one unique setting? It's a fraught issue. Is it Brandon Gallagher that's written most recently on this issue? You'll have to refresh my memory about this, Dr. Hilm, but I don't know. I know that the issue is not foreign to Orthodox experience in the context of ecumenical life as well. And so the ultimate conclusion I think that Bulgakov came to was that it was not possible to celebrate the Eucharist together and receive together. But I would need to refresh my reading of the sources before I could say for certain. But I mean, the classic position, of course, that the Orthodox churches have held is that Eucharistic sharing, common participation and receiving of the Eucharist is impossible until the unity of the churches has been achieved. So it's an end, not a means. Now I say this with no joy, absolutely no joy whatsoever. I say it with a sense of pain. And I think anybody personally, I think anybody who sees that position and embraces it, needs to recognize that pain involved. Maybe it itself can be an impetus toward working harder for the restoration of communion among our churches. I know even in saying things this way, I'm expressing my own view of church unity, and we can have conversations about that as well, of course.
That raises the question of the public liturgy and the private liturgy, mission, and unity. If you create this axis of questions, like, for example, in what way does private prayer participate in the church? And in what way does private prayer lead to the community? And then you have mission, of course. Yeah.
What a fantastic question, and one that's very apposite right now with the pandemic going on, isn't it? In terms of how we think about our community's responses to the restrictions around gathering together and the relationships between the private prayer. I don't even want to use that word. Let me rephrase that. I'm not criticizing you for using it, but I'm just, again, I'm correcting myself here in thinking out loud that if we are members one of another in the body of Christ through our baptism, then is our prayer ever private in the sense in which privacy or the private might be defined more broadly in our societies today? I don't know. I'm hesitant to say that, again, for reasons having to do with baptism. But it's a great question. And again, like everything else I've been saying today, I have no easy answers whatsoever for it, except to say that it seems to me we need to look again at baptism and the relationship of our prayer as individuals outside of the liturgical assembly and mission and baptism itself. I'd love to see a seminar on this sometime, to say the least.
Then to another perspective is, and that's shaping the local church through the liturgy. As you're quite aware of, I've forgotten the name of the author, but it was a book written about how indigenous orthodoxy is created when you turn to the native language, when you recruit native priests, and when you adopt the culture. And this was the Greek missionaries' call in the beginning of the 20th century. One of the fathers or architects about this was Anastasius of Albania, who argued that this is the only way to create the local church. But at the same time, now, changing language culture, doesn't that mean that you betray the Orthodox ethos, so to say?
You saved up all the hard questions for me today. Thanks a lot. I don't have any easy answers for that one either, because I'm just joking, of course. I appreciate the question a lot because it goes right to the issue of the ways in which Orthodox liturgical practices can come to live and thrive in local cultures. I would say, I would put it the other way around, rather than saying necessarily, okay, we're betraying the Orthodox ethos. I might be more worried about betraying the local culture by imposing upon it a particular manifestation of an Orthodox liturgical tradition, particularly in a linguistic form, using a particular language, whether it be Greek or English or what have you. That I think that respect and acknowledgement of local cultures would be something I would likely worry about more. I suspect, given the status of our liturgical texts and our received traditions around the way in which those texts are enacted, that we might not need to worry so much about betrayal of an orthodox ethos, but more about what we lose or what we might lose in coming to make that ethos speak in the language of a local culture. And I mean that in a broad sense, not simply a linguistic sense. But I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that, and it's understandable. And that's another conversation that would be interesting to have further. So thank you.
The last question before we wrap things up. There's still minutes left for an additional question if the listeners here are up to it. But the last question that concerns this perspective of local culture, and that's you talked about three perspectives in the beginning: worship, self-definition or self-understanding, and reform.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that the way you speak is to hear Schmemann in many ways. But in one aspect, you're very different from Schmemann. Mm-hmm. And that's worship. You would be saying the same thing as you were doing. Self-definition, yes, it's a matter of defining or re-understanding a little. That was his slogan, so to say. You don't need to change anything. We need to understand it in the original lore. But you add the third perspective, which I would say, to be critical towards Schmemann, he would never add that perspective. You're talking about reform. But you're not talking just about reform in the sense of reforming liturgy, but reforming the church through the liturgy. And that's a fourth perspective, I would say, which you introduced here, that the liturgy could be a kind of, if I would understand you correctly, a kind of lens for reforming the church. But at the same time, the liturgy in itself is a kind of imposition of a very strange culture for today. How would you use the liturgy for reforming the church? Or is it the dialectical relationship you're talking about here?
Fantastic question, and one that I fully deserve after what I've said. And let me preface this. And you've written extensively on Schmemann and know him more thoroughly than I do. So you may know of places where he speaks differently about this. But just thinking again out loud, I would say there's a dialectic involved here, partially having to do with the strangeness, the otherness of the very liturgical actions, words, gestures that we use as critical perspectives on what the church does in the rest of its life. And I say this for this reason. You know, of course, that reform or renewal was the step too far for Schmemann. And he even in places, talks about the need eventually for doing away with, getting rid of some dead wood, I think is the term he uses in one article at least. And so he points to the need of doing this, but in the end, he steps back and argues that really we shouldn't take that step, because what we need to do first is to reunite three things that had been separated, right? Liturgy, theology, and piety. And until those three things come together, we can't be in the place to change anything liturgically. And so what that means is it's never going to happen. But what I think for what it's worth, is that what we have here is the opportunity to see our own liturgical rites as containing, I mean, Schmemann talks about containing the experience of the joy of the feast to come. I'd say that's absolutely correct, but that he might not have drawn all of the critical implications of that experience. What does it mean that the reign of God has come? Surely it has significance for how the church lives its life here and now. That God isn't simply saying to us, everything's, we're doing everything in the church as God intends it, but rather in our celebration of our liturgies, in our praise of God, we are given a vision of how we could be, how we are called to be. And that's a long-term project, because it involves asking ourselves the question, I think, all right, what are we doing in our liturgy that could challenge us? What challenges the way that we, live our life as Christian communities around issues of power or service, or the ways in which we even spend our money? I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which these connections are possible, but we need to think through these things very carefully. What I'm trying to avoid here is saying, okay, we've got to have some kind of external criterion here that we need to apply. So I'd probably say, Schmemann is onto something when he's saying, we've got what we need right here, but we need to live out of it in ways we might not have lived out of it before. And I just want to add here, I'm saying all of this, folks, not as somebody who's like self-righteously saying everything that's wrong with the church. That's the last thing I'm saying. Like if I'm going to start anywhere, I start with my own shortcomings, rather than pointing the finger at anyone. But I simply want to draw out what I think are the critical prophetic dimensions of Schmemann's own work in that way, and in ways that I don't think he did.
I do think that one of the problems with Schmemann was that he believed that theology, liturgy, and piety could be unified. I think it's not possible. But I would say even today, when I have developed my own thinking, I don't think even it's desirable. I think these three should be distinct. And that's the only way to make a reform possible. If you mix them up, it becomes a holistic vision which nobody can touch.
Yeah.
So, but I am most thankful for your lecture. And I think we all have the same view that you create an interest of liturgy, which can make the foundation for your vision of making St. Ignatius the birthplace for a fruitful, intercultural, and liturgical discussion on reform of a church. And I think that's the challenge that you have presented, and which are something that we all have to bring to our hearts and try to continue with. And I rely that you will be forwarding this vision in your work in St. Ignatius. So welcome to St. Ignatius. Thank you so much. And thank you for all who have been listening and viewing you. And the next lecture will be on, I will say it very exactly now. Next lecture is December 3rd, when Dr. Miriam Lindgren will speak on texts, readers, and the church, biblical studies in Eastern Christianity. So text, readers, and the church, biblical studies in Eastern Christianity, December 3rd at the same time. So thank you and goodbye.